Hey everyone, welcome to today's video where we're going to talk about AMD and how this company is essentially unbeatable. Why do I say that AMD is unbeatable? Well, they have too many business segments and they are excelling at too many of these, and the valuation is, in my opinion, quite realistic and low. It's not in the stratosphere like a company like, let's say, Palantir with like super high valuation. So the valuation is low in AMD. We know that they're not only dependent on a single business unit. For example, if you look at Nvidia, currently the most valued company on the planet, over $4 trillion in market valuation, right? But essentially 95% of that lays into the AI GPU manufacturing and the high margins that they have there. They also have 90 to 95% of the market share. So at some point in the not too distant future, they might face, either if they lose market share, now you might say that the entire market will increase. But if it doesn't, like if we are, let's say, hitting a ceiling, that could be a bit of a risk. I don't think we are going to hit any ceiling anytime soon, so I wouldn't be too worried about Nvidia stock either. But I would say in that scenario, there's higher risk to Nvidia. If you now look at AMD, they have 5 to, let's say, 8% market share. So they can, even if the market is stagnating or even shrinking, they could still just gain billions and billions of revenue, stealing essentially from the market leader Nvidia, something that AMD did in the CPU space over the past decade, where Intel now is kind of struggling. So before we look into the AI GPU revenue expected for AMD and how they compare to Nvidia going forwards in this year, second half of 2025, with the MI355X, which seems to get somewhat of attraction, and also going into next year with MI400, which probably will be a real threat to Nvidia. I would say MI400 is probably for the first time essentially in the AI GPU space where Nvidia is actually facing a challenge, because all the chips previously from AMD, MI300 launched in December of 2023, was great chip on a single chip to chip basis, but it kind of lacked as you scaled up, like as you connected 10, 100, 1,000, tens of thousands of GPUs together. That's where Nvidia started to run away with it, with latency and the communication between those, tens of thousands of chips, in addition to the software advantage of CUDA. But starting with MI350X, they tackle some of the issues in that regard. We saw that Oracle is going to order, I think, 30,000 MI355Xs in one single data center potentially. We've also heard rumors about Facebook looking at, or like Meta looking at ordering up to almost 300,000 MI355Xs. Now we don't know if all of them are going to be in a single data center, but the sheer fact that Meta is supposedly wanting to order 300,000 MI355Xs says quite a lot for AMD. So how much would a supposed order of 300,000 MI300Xs, 355Xs from Meta be? Well, the latest rumor, especially from the analysts, is that AMD is actually starting to increase their average sales price. Previously have accounted for 10 to 15,000 US dollar per chip. But now with the performance and getting closer to Nvidia, rumors are that AMD is potentially charging up to 25 to maybe even 27,000 US dollar per chip. Assuming Facebook puts an order of 300,000 of those, that's almost 7.5 billion US dollar in lifetime revenue only from one single chip for AMD. For sure, for Nvidia, this is like a normal week, or I don't know, every other 2 weeks they might sell this amount of chips. But for AMD, this is unheard of. In 2024, last year, they sold 5 billion or so in entire year of MI300X sales. And now you're talking about a potential deal with Facebook that is valued at 7 to 7.5 billion lifetime. And then we haven't even went into MI400. But enough about numbers of potential revenue. Let's look at the technical reasoning why AMD might start to have some advantages. So remember MI300 before we look at the up and coming MI355X. Don't forget that MI300, it's a chiplet design. The same strategy that AMD used for their AMD Ryzen Epic chips, right? Do you see this chip design here? All these small blocks of the yellow or gold are chiplets, and they connect 12 of these together to get this AMD Turin Zen 5 based Epic CPU for servers, like general purpose CPUs, not for AI modeling, just general purpose CPUs. So they connect all these chiplets together, and looking at MI300, which is the basis of MI355X and the same design philosophy, I guess, although I'm not an obviously chip architect, I've tried to read a little bit upon this kind of stuff. And you can see that the main segment is the 8 so-called XCDs on the right here, right? And this is where they have their, state-of-the-art chiplet technology. They are utilizing the newest nodes on TSMC. So obviously on MI300, I believe these are 5nm chiplets. Going to MI400 next year, they are talking about TSMC 3nm chiplets, the more transistor dense node from TSMC, and they will shrink essentially the footprint of these XCDs, the 8 of them. And what does it mean? Well, so looking at this die calculator, you can see that I assume the 9mm times 10mm in footprint of this XCD die for MI400, which means that we have roughly 90 square millimeters of die footprint, which is the rumored numbers. And a 300mm wafer on, let's say, 3nm chip design from TSMC, we expect to have 660 potential full dies if the yield is okay, if the manufacturing goes perfectly fine, which it never does. There is obviously some yield issue, so you will always have some defects. And looking at this calculator from Semi-Analysis, give it a follow, they would expect to have roughly 600 to 604 good dies. What does it mean? It means that for each of the good dies, they have to pay roughly $33. Now, let's look at the design philosophy of Nvidia, the main competitor, the market leader. So this is Blackwell. I mean, you can see on this image here, right? Two big, like huge chips in the middle, and they're communicating, these two blocks here, they're essentially communicating with each other. So this is essentially like Blackwell, I believe B200, maybe even B300, I don't remember exactly. But this big square in the middle is around 750 square millimeters. So what does it mean for the same, if you now have to carve out a certain amount of good dies as much as possible from the same 300mm square millimeter wafer? Well, you will get potentially 64 dies, of which only 30 are good. So the yield is less than half. So let me say that again. AMD on the 90 square millimeter dies would expect a yield of roughly 91.5% on the same, TSMC 3nm node, whereas Nvidia would have a yield of roughly 47 to 48%, because simply the larger the die, the more the defect density comes into the picture, and each die would cost Nvidia roughly $600 US, 666. So you can see again then, compared to AMD, each die costs 33, so 20 times less. Now we know that AMD for each MI, let's say 400, will have X of those 8 of those dies. So that's essentially 8 times 33, right? That's one single MI300 or MI355 or MI400 X chip. 8 times 33, let's say 8 times 30, that's $240 US of compute dies. Whereas Nvidia has to pay like 600. So that's a 3-to-1 ratio advantage for AMD, right? Now again, there's additional issues with the chiplet strategy. Let's not forget that Nvidia then in one sense, they have their chip, then they connect them together, 2 of those or 1 of those for like B100, I believe, and that's about it. Now look at AMD. They have to connect these chips together, right? They have to like make sure that these chips are communicating to each other, and you will have some additional yield drop off. Obviously, no manufacturing is perfect. So once they connect all these chiplets together, they will have some drop off in manufacturing. That's the complexity of the chiplet design in one sense, right? But I think the AMD calculation here is that it's paying off. It paid off against Intel. I mean, looking at Intel, this is quite interesting, right? SemiWiki, the same guys that made the die calculator, they have this really interesting discussion here about Intel potentially struggling with the 14A process. Intel is, remember, on manufacturing side, competing with TSMC. So there's a lot of dark clouds above Intel. And how did Intel end up in this position? Well, essentially one single trick that AMD used for the chiplet design. Obviously it's simplifying a lot, but essentially what happened, the chiplet design philosophy of AMD just absolutely destroyed whatever market dominance that Intel used to have, right? I mean, you look at the server market share from Passmark here, supposed server market share. Remember, you have to take these numbers with a grain of salt. Although I say that when you look at the red numbers from 2012, 13 and so on, I would say these are correct. And then in 2017-18, with the first, like I believe, Rome and Naples for AMD, the Epic chip lineup, which started to threat Intel, they started to gain market share. And now, over the past couple of quarters or years, they have this huge shift in the market sentiment to going back to AMD being essentially a market leader. Still, they don't have 50% market share. It takes time, but they're gonna get there, I guess, within a year or two. So don't get bugged off on because there's a lot of discussion online about how accurate this number is. I would say it's very difficult to say that this is completely accurate, the actual absolute value of the numbers. But what you would say is the trend is absolutely true. I mean, I'm not surprised that AMD now is gonna enter our face within this couple of years, that they're gonna go from being a large player on the server CPU market share to being like the dominant player, like having 50-60% market share, essentially reversing Intel's lead with all the struggles that Intel currently having. Can that translate to AI GPUs? Difficult to say. And to be honest, I'm not expecting AMD to take like tens of billions of revenue every single quarter from Nvidia, even in an increasingly larger market. So I don't talk from like negative from in point of view of Nvidia, but I'm saying that the point of this video was to show you that AMD is like unbreakable. There is so little risk with AMD, in my opinion, that this is one of the best opportunities in the market, despite the stock now obviously being over 2x after the dip that we saw like in, I believe, early February and March of this year. If you look at over the past 6 months, I mean, you can see here that in February they were at $80 or something, and now they're at 160. But remember, there is only one single analyst that you should follow, and this is this guy, Hans Mosesmann. In that time when every single analyst or a lot of them started to come out with downgrades, this guy still, obviously, he actually reduced his, I think, price target of AMD from $250 to 225. He didn't go back like from 250 to 100, right? But this guy, I've been following him for the longest of time, and he's the main guy to follow on AMD price targets. And he has actually not upgraded his price targets in essentially a year or two. So I think as the market is starting to prepare for AMD getting more competitive on the, AI GPU market, I wouldn't be surprised that this guy again sets the bar. Like if he was, the street high price target of 250 last year or 18 months ago, would I be surprised with the news coming in from AMD that this guy would increase his price targets above 300? Not at all. Why do I say that? Remember, AMD, it's not only AI GPUs. Do not forget that. I mean, Steam Deck, selling like 1.5 million of these globally. This is the first iteration of Steam Deck, right? The Steam Deck 2.0 is going to come out very soon, and that's going to also be AMD. And they're going to probably charge a little bit more premium on this one. And if Steam Deck becomes a more household name in the market, maybe they're going to sell 2 or 3 million of these every year. And maybe in 5 years from now, they're going to sell 10 million of these, right? So Steam Deck is a real thing. Handhelds are overall, like Asus ROG Ally, same thing with AMD, right? Then again, let's not forget that AMD also is dominant in the server CPU market share. This is like the forgotten child of data centers. Everyone, when they talk about data centers in this last couple of years, they think about, Nvidia AI GPUs. But there's a whole world of like tens of billions, multiple tens of billions of US dollar in server CPU spend, which AMD, as I showed you on this, obviously, server market share graph, that they're starting to get potentially 50% very, very soon, in a couple of years time at most. Then we also have the field, FPGA, the business that AMD bought from Xilinx in 2021 maybe, or 2022. I mean, these guys are selling chips that are 5,000 to 20,000 US dollar to companies within space, within military, within medicine, your X-ray machines and all this kind of stuff. Especially when I say like 5 to 20,000 price target on those Alveo or Xilinx chips, probably more for the space kind of and military space. They need to make sure that radiation don't affect the compute power on those. So it's a lot of like engineering going into the chips that you send into space. And Starlink with their Starlink satellite network, they have like, I don't know, like 7,000 or 8,000 Starlink satellites up in the atmosphere, and they're gonna probably add another 2 or 3,000 of those. And in space, you want redundancy, so you're not satisfied with one single chip. Usually, you might have like 2 or 3 chips per satellite, and there's multiple AMD FPGAs in these Starlink satellites, I believe. So you might have a situation where each Starlink satellite has 50 to 100,000 US dollar worth of AMD chips. I don't know, don't hold me to those numbers. I just speculate a little bit here, but you'd be sure that there's redundancy. There's many of them, and they don't cost 500 US dollar, because this is stuff that goes into space and has a lifetime of, I believe Starlink satellites have at least 5 years of lifetime. So AMD is so much more than AI GPU. And despite all of that, all the discussion online is essentially revolving around AI GPUs. And I still have not even talked about, the laptop market share that they are, again, gaining market share from, the likes of Intel. And remember also, in the laptop market share, Nvidia has been very, very dominant on the gaming side in laptops because they're gaming GPUs. But with AMD now launching these things called APUs, essentially they combine a CPU and a GPU together in a single package. And that way AMD is essentially, especially on the lower end, if you're familiar with the gaming market, Nvidia 4060, 5060, 3060, that kind of segment of the market. In a couple of years time, I wouldn't be surprised if AMD is gonna eating into that market share also from Nvidia. So this company has so many different legs, and even if the AI play doesn't fully, challenge Nvidia, they have so many other stuff to compete on, so you wouldn't be worried. But looking a little bit more now in details on the server CPU stuff, right? Remember that I mentioned that AMD has a yield advantage. They have smaller, 8 smaller chips that they connect together. And also remember that there's one thing, that AMD will have advantage on memory on chip. If you compare, for example, let's say we compare, I don't know, MI355X, it has 288 gigabytes of HBM3. The successor MI400 will have 432 gigabytes of HBM4. What will the Nvidia equivalent in 2026 have in amount of memory per single GPU, per Rubin GPU as they are called? Well, I believe Nvidia will have 288 gigabytes of HBM4. Why can't they have it? Why can't Nvidia have 432? Obviously, Nvidia relies on connecting more GPUs together in a smarter way. This is something where AMD is trying to challenge Nvidia. This is, I believe, one of the reasons why the larger training clusters, from OpenAI, from Grok, or Google's whatever Gemini 2.5 or 3.5 that comes in the future, those models are trained on mostly Nvidia, or essentially 99% probably. Because Nvidia, despite having less amount of memory capacity on a single chip, when they connect them together, they can connect tens of thousands and now hundreds of thousands of GPUs together. AMD cannot do that until essentially MI400 in much larger scale, and to some degree MI355X. But also, on a single chip basis, AMD already is ahead of Nvidia. And one of the reasons is, I would say, the way AMD designs their chips. So when I tell that AMD is using chiplets, they make sure that they use the state-of-the-art node for the 8 XCDs that are, calculating the FP4 and FP8 matrix multiplications, which is essentially what the large language models rely on. But when it comes to this all other silicon, like the IO dies and the SRAM and DRAM, of all those kind of stuff, they don't scale as well with the newer nodes. So why would you pay to have use the expensive TSMC 3 nanometer on all of the silicon, on the XCDs on the compute, but also on the IO die and SRAM and DRAM, when you can only focus on using the most state of the art for the stuff that counts? And then maybe you can use TSMC legacy nodes, or at least a couple of generation older nodes, 6 nanometer for the IO die, for the SRAM and DRAM, because don't scale nearly as well. But when it comes to Nvidia, since they are using one single chip and everything has to be in this 750 or 800 square millimeters, this means that everything here, the core, as you can see, this die shot here, the core, the big square in the middle, that's probably where all the matrix multiplications magic happening. But then all this other stuff around, IO SerDes here, and management logic and all this other stuff, doesn't technically need to be on the state-of-the-art TSMC 3 nanometer. But because Nvidia is using monolithic dies and AMD is using chiplet design, this means that AMD can pick and choose where to use the more expensive node, whereas Nvidia cannot. They have to, if they go for the expensive node, everything has to be used on this expensive node. And one other advantage I mentioned about yield, right? AMD has much better yield with their smaller chips. This means also that AMD can earlier access the newer nodes. This is something that Nvidia cannot. Like if you're very early on like TSMC 2 nanometer or 14 angstroms or whatever that is in the future, you cannot like directly out of the gate when TSMC starts manufacturing with 2 nanometer, you cannot directly go to this like these gigantic chips. The yield just doesn't work out. Because by that time, I mean early on the process node, let's say let's have play around with it. So if the defect density is instead of 0.1, 0.2, you can see that even, I mean the yield went from 47% to 23%. And if the defect density is like, I don't know, 0.3, the yield went like, I don't know, 14%. So you get like 9 good dies, or essentially you're wasting, as you can see here, 89% of your total silicon wafer. But look at the same idea. So now using the 0.3 defect rate on AMD smaller chips. So let's have a look at that. 0.3. Obviously this will also affect AMD negatively. It's after all physics. But you can see still even like at defect density of 0.3, AMD still has, you know, a yield of 76%, higher than Nvidia had even at 0.1. So there's a lot of advantages to AMD. And I think like one other unmentioned advantage here is also the faster pace of iteration. I mean AMD, for all we know, they can use the same IO die and the same memory controllers and just change the XCDs, like, you know, from MI300 to MI400. They might like keep a lot of the same design stuff and design language from MI300 and only change where they get value for their money, which is the XCDs. So iteration comes faster. And if you're like quality controlling in the R&D phase of design of these chips, it's much easier to, you know, find defects in smaller XCDs that are 90 square millimeters than finding design flaws in a chip that is like 750 square millimeters, which Nvidia does. So I think going forward, there's a lot of advantages for AMD. I'm still positive on Nvidia because my understanding is that the general market is so screaming for compute for AI GPUs. So Nvidia is gonna be just fine. But in this video, I'm just trying to explain to you that AMD is state of the art on the AI GPU, but there's a bunch of other stuff that AMD is excelling at. You know, the gaming side, and the gaming is not only like your GPUs or even PlayStation 5 or upcoming PS6 in a couple of years from now. It's handhelds, you know, it's laptop gaming. Then you have all this like, you know, medical stuff, you know, with their FPGAs, the satellite stuff from SpaceX, but also their competitor in that space, which is, I believe, Amazon. They have Amazon Kuiper or something like that, doing essentially the same stuff. They probably will need FPGAs, and AMD has like 50% market share, FPGA market share. So it's, again, this was just a much longer video, but I try to explain to you that there's so much going on, and this company is not so highly valued. If you look at the fundamentals of AMD stock, currently looking at by market cap, sitting at around, I believe, 270 billion US dollar. And I believe the price to earnings ratio for the next year is probably like 38. I mean, this is from, all the numbers, but looking at the potential of this company, I believe they will have maybe 5 to 6 US dollar earnings per share already maybe next year. I mean, this is my older graph from way back. You can see we are at Q1 and Q2 here, but I see that AMD will have explosive growth in the earnings per share. You can see Q3 and Q4 numbers. Where that does come from, well, if you look at the actual numbers here, I expect that the guidance that AMD will give on the earnings in Q2, which is I believe on the 5th of August, so a couple of weeks from now, 10 days from now, I believe they will have a huge Q3 and even larger Q4. Maybe not 9.3 billion from expected 7.5 to 7.7 billion in Q2, but even 8.5, like that's already like what, 20%, 15% increase quarter over quarter, and then Q4 will be humongous. And still we haven't even looked at, you know, any quarters with revenue coming in from MI400. MI400 is going to be even closer to Nvidia. Nvidia will still be the leader in large, you know, training scale, but I would say they're cutting down the difference between those two. So yeah, that's going to be probably it from today's video. Please like and comment and engage in the comment section. Do you believe that my thesis that AMD is so broad that there's like nothing that's going to fail this company anytime soon? And where can they improve? And I guess, yeah, see you in the next one.